China is the largest country by population and the second largest economy in the world. But if I asked you to name your favorite Chinese band, your answer most likely would be why? Is it that the country is simply too poor or too authoritarian to cultivate a music scene? Has our geopolitical rivalry made cultural exchange undesirable? Or is it something else?
Most Chinese bands don't work on Facebook, YouTube, even Bandcamp. We need a VPN, need like this, that.
For starters, China does have an underground music scene, and it is bonkers. During my brief foray investigating online, I quickly realized China had some of the coolest post-punk, psychedelic, and indie music anywhere. But it's also true that these bands operate under conditions that would be quite foreign to us as Westerners. Whether it's touring by train and bus, using an entirely separate array of social media websites, submitting your music to censors before publishing, or playing shows with the constant presence of plainclothed officers. The musicians in this scene are some of the bravest, funniest, and most creative you'll find anywhere. I spoke with Lolly from Beijing's famous record label Maybe Mars, and was fortunate to have all of my nagging questions answered. Do you think shoegaze is particularly popular?
I think it was, but now less and less bands doing shoegaze.
So without further ado, let's dive into the strange and wild world of China's underground music. Trying to sum up China's sound with a simple label is difficult. Is metal that popular?
No, it's not. It's going down now in China. There's another genre called city pop. Do you know?
I'm not familiar.
It's very weird genre, city pop. It's like a chilling, love, beach, summer, something like that. But actually we have very good band in many different genres, yeah.
A lot of the music popular today has roots outside China's borders, like city pop, which comes from Japan, or the band Re-Tros, whose frontman studied in Germany. There's the psychedelic punk of bands like Backspace or Dream Can. And of course, shoegaze, no matter how out of date it might be getting. Learning about these bands is no easy task. To say China operates on a separate internet is not an exaggeration. Instead of Facebook, it's WeChat. Instead of Twitter, it's Weibo. YouTube is Youku. Spotify is Tencent. For someone in China to access the forbidden version is not impossible. They just need a VPN and a little bit of know-how. But it's created an environment where very few Chinese people chat with those outside their country, and very few of us chat with them. To explain how it got this way requires a bit of a history lesson. As with other communist countries in the 20th century, music in China was required to serve the political interest of the government. As Mao declared in 1942, music was to awaken and arouse the popular masses, urging them on to unity and struggle. Music for the sake of entertainment was bourgeois, and during the Cultural Revolution, academies were closed, instruments were destroyed, and musicians were sent to the countryside to work as peasants. Meanwhile, in communist Europe, things had eased up rather quickly. By the 1960s, Soviet teens could get their fix of the Beatles through bootleg records. But in China, this never happened. In fact, it wasn't until 1980, after the death of Mao, that millions of Chinese people heard the Beatles for the first time. During the central TV station's evening news, a story about John Lennon's recent passing played a few segments of Beatles songs, including Strawberry Fields Forever. From then on, China's gradual opening to the outside world allowed music to trickle in slowly. First, from records brought in by international students, and later from daco, scrap tapes and CDs that were sold to China as reusable plastic. Although Chinese customs would clip the tapes to make them unlistenable, not quite ready to allow the free distribution of all Western music, crafty music fans would figure out how to restore them. So even as the country began to open up economically, the mechanisms of censorship remained in place, the government deciding which albums, movies, and now websites to allow through its borders. But back to the story. Cutout tapes were expensive, hard to find, and more importantly, hard to understand. Language barrier aside, imagine spending your whole childhood listening to the same 8 revolutionary operas, then stumbling across Sister Ray by the Velvet Underground. As much as we like to brag that we loved it from the first listen, oftentimes that isn't the case. But nevertheless, groups of young people gathered for bedroom listening parties, soaking in each new album they could get their hands on, and slowly making sense of the 40-odd-year history of rock and pop that they had missed. One such kid was Jian, often dubbed China's first rock star. Now, frankly, the music is a bit more like 80s power ballads than dirty rock and roll. But it was huge for the psyche of Chinese youth at the time. His song, Nothing to My Name, was emblematic of the poverty and emptiness people felt at the conclusion of the Cultural Revolution. Jian's music became anthems for the student democracy movement. He even performed at Tiananmen Square in May of 1989. Mere weeks before, well, you know what happened. But for our purposes, it was a watershed moment. The era of homegrown Chinese rock music had officially begun. Now, fast forwarding a bit, by 1997, all types of music had entered China, and fans of the weirder and wilder stuff were beginning to find each other, albeit in tiny numbers. In the city of Nanjing, 23-year-old Yan Haisun fell into a group of music fans that would hang out, shop for cutout tapes, and listen to bands like Joy Division and The Clash. Their own punk scene was tiny, maybe 5 bands in total, heavily scorned by their families and neighbors. But that year, Yan formed a group that would change the course of Chinese indie music forever. Called PK-14, they were inspired by the DIY ethos of Fugazi, English post-punk, and the protest folk of Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie. After moving to Beijing in 2001, they became a major force in the emerging indie scene. Through their lyrics, music videos, and insane live shows, they pushed the boundaries on what a newly opened China was ready for. And by self-releasing music and touring by train and bus, at least in the early days, they paved the way for countless more underground bands to follow suit. Hai Sun also became an engineer and producer, much like Steve Albini, seeking out bands he personally loved and helping them with their debut releases. In the mid-2000s, he played a role in another pivotal moment, producing the first album of Carsick Cars. Formed by university students in Beijing, Carsick Cars struck that delicate balance between pop-punk and noise freakouts. Their anthemic track, Zhong Hai, named after the cigarette brand of the same name, was simple enough to be sung by just about everyone. It's probably no coincidence they were one of the first bands to attract attention outside China. In 2007, they opened a pair of dates for Sonic Youth on tour in Europe. The following year, they played All Tomorrow's Parties in London, and later, South by Southwest. Meanwhile, Yan Hai Sun continued to discover and produce dozens of more underground bands. It seemed like every wild album I came across had his fingerprints on it. For example, from Chengdu, Hiperson plays dramatic and philosophical indie punk. Their first album came out in 2015, recorded by Hai Sun and released by Lolly's record label, Maybe Mars. Or FAZI from Jian, a band with a wide-ranging sound, from the instrumental Dead Sea to the noise pop of The Root of Innocence. Both records, again, recorded by Hai Sun. But while the music scene was indeed growing and maturing, I think it's important to point out how it was still quite niche, at least relative to the size of the country.
The bars and very small venues, like cafes, there are about 4 to 5 ones, mid-sized venue, 3 to 4, and one big venue. But the thing is, it changes quite fast. Maybe every 5 years, some venues got shut down and some new ones open.
For comparison, in my home city of Chicago, which is 1/8 the size of Beijing, there's at least some 25 venues for indie bands, making Chicago's music scene, by crude comparison, 20 times larger. And what is the reason they get shut down?
I think the big reason is the government thing. They don't quite support, and sometimes the venue is in small street and people, complain about the noise.
While small enough bands are mostly able to slip under China's surveillance radar, bands in venues alike can be victims of their own success. Rock venues, which are called live houses in China, are often shut down unceremoniously by way of zoning changes, or by the presence of plain-clothed officers who will harass patrons if there's rumors of drug use. All record labels have to go through an esoteric censorship process, which involves submitting lyrics, recordings, and band member ID cards to a partly government-owned publisher. There's no clear list of what's allowed and what's not, the former operations manager of Maybe Mars told Rolling Stone last year. If an album is rejected, they resubmit to a different publisher until somebody approves it. And this is all not to mention the censorship of performances, which can be politically motivated, like when Jian was banned from Beijing after Tiananmen Square. Or it can be completely arbitrary, like when Carsick Cars were pulled last minute from supporting Sonic Youth in 2007. It makes it all the more impressive that, in spite of these uncertainties, the underground scene has continued to grow. Does every city pretty much have at least one indie venue?
Only the big cities, for like smaller city, sometimes we play in the bar. The equipment is not very good, but can do. Yeah.
In 2015, American journalist John visited many of these tour stops, capturing the sights, sounds, and energy of a country beginning to explore its punk ethos.
No water, no window, and that's the scene.
The whole thing is free to watch on YouTube, which I'll link to below. Throughout his many short interviews, you meet adventurers,
爬牆逃跑
artists,
look like gray, but you have to find a difference between grades.
critics,
二手的美国，一个二手的，
optimists,
其实每个城市里头都有一些
and cynics.
就是我觉得摇滚乐应该就是，
我觉得有意义啊。
我觉得没意义。
Their feelings on Chinese politics and society are complicated. Criticisms can be harsh, albeit worded
该
carefully.
毁的差不多了，然后所有的
But there's no denying that each and every one of them are tapped in. They may represent a tiny portion of the population, but they are carrying the torch, so to speak.
I would suggest them to read this book. Our bands could be your life.
Granted, 2015 does feel like ages ago. A time before COVID, before trade wars, before Uyghur camps, Hong Kong protests, the expanding surveillance state. It does make me wonder how things have changed between then and now. On the one hand, you see headlines about venues getting shut down, bands being censored, a promising indie scene now in decline. On the other hand, indie rock has become more popular than ever, thanks in no small part to the hit reality show, The Big Bang.
That's a variety show, only for indie band. And that show changed the life of many bands. You know, before the income of the band playing one show maybe just 2,000 RMB, and now after the show they're a millionaire.
Free to watch online with English subtitles, this season-long reality competition is surreal. It has all the trappings of an American Idol-like show. Snappy judges,
哎呀，真恶心！
dramatic backstories, camera confessionals,
这段掐了别播啊！我妈妈看到。
and, of course, an overbearing beverage sponsor. But the kicker is, the music is actually pretty good. For example, Re-Tros, which is that industrial post-punk band we heard at the start of the video. Well, they actually won last year's competition. A bona fide good band with loads of indie cred. It's almost like Death Grips winning at America's Got Talent.
The good side is bands got popular, they have better life, and more people know indie music. But the bad side is like most live houses were full of people, and some bands want to book the venue but I cannot book because it's too popular in a sudden.
While I do understand the concern about a subversive indie scene getting watered down, I think that overall it's a good problem to have. Holding a debate about sellouts and authenticity seems like a rite of passage for an emerging music scene. Not to mention, some of the best records that I heard had just come out in the last couple years, like Persephone's Seasons from the Shanghai band RUBUR. Or just about anything from the band Backspace, one of my personal favorites on this list. From their music, which takes elements of krautrock into smooth punk jams, to their visuals, it seems like everything this band does is fascinating. Coming from a small town in the south of China, they relocated to the indie scene capital, Beijing, where they signed with Maybe Mars. Their most recent release, 2022's Face of the Night, features the epic Face Mask Tragedy. A song, Radii China reports, is about the distance between lovers caused by the need to wear face masks in this modern world. From this end, it would appear that China's indie scene is still doing its thing, being subversive, weird, and fun, adapting in the face of lockdowns and restrictions, and staying creative. To those of us watching from abroad, whatever we think about the politics and current events, here's to hoping the indie scene stays this way for many more years to come.